Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 9:02 right now, and I see that we still have some people joining, but we're going to kick it off. My name is Kayla Ellis from the Community Foundation, and I will be moderating this event today. I'd like to welcome you all to this training that is part of the Community Foundation's 2020 nonprofit training and webinar schedule, which is sponsored by First Source Federal Credit Union. We're so glad that you are able to join us here today for this training titled Charting a Course to Campaign Readiness. Just a couple reminders before we get started. This is a webinar, so all attendees are in listen and view only mode. If you do have a question during the duration of the presentation, we ask that you please enter it into the chat box, and we will be stopping a couple times throughout and definitely at the end to address any questions that come in. Now to get started, I would like to introduce our trainer for today. Some of you may know him. Michael Stein is principal at Michael Stein Consulting, where he brings over 35 years of development experience and background to the practice. In his role as a consultant, Mike has worked with a variety of clients, including the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, Krause Health Foundation, SUNY Cortland, and several organizations in the Utica area, including Masonic Medical Research Institute, Munson Williams, the House of the Good Shepherd, Central New York Conservancy, just to name a few. He has lectured on fundraising topics for many organizations and academic institutions all throughout New York State. We're so glad to have him here today to talk about capital campaigns, and we hope that you find this presentation useful. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike to unmute, and I will hand it over to him.
I'm officially unmuted and I'm ready to go. Thank you very much, Kayla. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. And I'm happy to be with all of you here today. And I thank you for inviting me to talk on this topic. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Certainly, capital campaigns is a large part of what I do as a fundraising consultant. It's not the only thing I do, but it's certainly a large part of it and perhaps the most significant and substantial part of what I do. So charting a course to campaign readiness, the title. I don't know if that's a catchy title. Perhaps catchier might be getting ready to get ready for a capital campaign. And that's really what we're talking about today. I'm not really talking, I mean, obviously this will spill over somewhat into what is a capital, what comprises the actual campaign itself. But really the focus today is what happens kind of the pre-work. And we'll touch on a number of things as it relates to that. One thing I would ask you, this is a new format for me in terms of presenting. I haven't done Zoom presentations before of this type for this large an audience. I'm typically one who likes to interact with the audience, ask a lot of questions while we're going through. That's not going to work, obviously. But I realize too that you may have many questions. And so what I would ask you to do is use the chat room for that purpose. Kayla will keep me honest and stop me at points if there are questions, or I may then take a pause and say, are there questions that I can address now? But please write those questions down as they come up, because my experience, and of course I'm a little older than most of you, I suspect, is that I tend to forget those questions if I don't write them down. So we'll do questions at a couple points throughout the presentation, and then also have some time at the end. And then anyone who has a question they want to ask that we don't get to today, my contact information, I believe, is on the last slide, if I remember correctly. And if it's not, certainly the Community Foundation can provide it for you. So happy to get started. We can go to the next slide. I'm glad I can't see a picture of myself. That's always disconcerting. So we'll go, and I'll give you an overview of what we're going to cover today. So first we'll start with what are some of the questions to consider when you're planning a capital campaign, when you're starting to getting ready to get ready, as I put it. What are some of the questions you should be asking and answering for yourself and for your organization? We'll talk then about what I call the campaign readiness assessment, kind of the internal focus, the assessment on where we are as an organization, where we are as a development function within that organization, and where do we need to be in order to be ready to undertake a capital campaign. And That's the internal look. Then you go to the external look. And that's when we talk about, everybody has a different name for it. All consultants have different names for this. The fancier the name, the more they charge you. So that's why I call it the strategic advancement study rather than the feasibility study. If you call it the feasibility study, you can't charge as much. That's a joke, folks. It's hard to tell jokes on Zoom, but that was a joke. Seriously, this is an important part of the process. The strategic advancement study is typically when you go out and interview. We'll talk about that in some detail. From there, you move into, you use the information that you glean from those external interviews and you move into the actual campaigning planning process, and then you get ready to launch that campaign. Two bonus additions in this presentation are, one is how to integrate plan giving into your campaign, one possible way to do that. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but I do think it's important because I think, especially where we live in upstate New York, and I say we, I live in Cooperstown, so I'm not that far away. Where we live in upstate New York, it is a veritable plan giving gold mine. What planned gifts are not going to the community foundation in this community could be coming to your organization. My friend Nick Grimmer is here to my left, who's responsible for bringing those planned gifts into the community foundation. So he's grimacing a little bit, but nonetheless, there are planned gifts out there. And while your campaign may not be focused on planned gifts, you don't want to leave those gifts on the table if they present themselves. And then the last thing I'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about is planning for a campaign in a post-COVID world, which is, of course, well, we're not really quite post-COVID yet. We're mid-COVID, I would say. But certainly, if your organization is thinking about a campaign in the near future, COVID is going to be part of that reality. So want to move on to there. The key in all of this is that preparation is the key to success. So the next slide, what is a campaign? What is a campaign? So I'll read it right from the screen because I think it says it as well as anything else. A campaign is a large scale, these are important terms, large scale, long term, intensive, all those terms, all those phrases are meaningful in this regard. Effort to achieve a goal. So to achieve a strategic goal, I'm just setting up my slides a little bit. Okay, good. Now, where does that term come from? This is always interesting. I'm not sure. It doesn't come from champagne, which is what you crack when you reach your campaign goal. It comes from the Greek, I believe it is, or yeah, Roman, excuse me, Campania, which was wartime operations from the armies of the Roman Empire. Probably an appropriate metaphor. I always talk about campaigns when I come into a new client. Campaign is the fundraising equivalent of war. We're marshaling all our resources towards a common objective. So intensive fundraising effort, raise a specified sum of money. So you have a goal. It's not just we're going to go out and raise money. That's not a campaign. That's the annual fund. We're going to go out and raise a specific amount of money that we're going to tell people within a defined time period to meet various asset building needs of this organization. It could be a capital campaign, which would be to build a building. It could be an endowment campaign to build your endowment. It is any number of things. It can be a comprehensive campaign, as many of the colleges do, which really meets a variety of objectives, what they call buckets. But for each organization, it's going to be something different. Not on the slides, but what I want to talk about is what is not a campaign. Well, that's not this next slide yet, Nick. What is not a campaign, this is off script. A campaign, so for many smaller organizations, and I did get a chance to look at those of you who had signed up as of yesterday, and I would say that most of you are from relatively smaller development shops, as I would expect. So for many smaller organizations, your development function is primarily comprised of a series of events that help you raise money. So a campaign for you would not be doing bigger and better events and raising more money through your events. Within the context of a campaign, special events really function as a cultivation tool. They're very valuable and they're important. They raise some money, but they're not going to raise the type of money that you need to succeed, to achieve a campaign goal. The phrase I use is you're not going to bake sale your way to prosperity in a capital campaign. You've got to go out. So what campaigns focus on is face-to-face, individual, well, it used to be face-to-face, it may now be Zoom to Zoom, personal interactions with prospects talking about gifts. So just want to make that clear. The next slide, contrary to popular belief, if we can get the next slide, The proper spelling is not capital campaign, although there is indeed an element of pain that's involved in this. This is tough work. This is, for those of you who've been in development for a while, and again, I don't know, because normally I would ask all those questions in advance, but it's too hard to get that through a Zoom meeting. But for those of you who've been in development for a while and not done a capital campaign, you will find this the most, in some ways, painful, but also rewarding period of your professional career. And it really is a defining element of your professional career as well. So with that, we'll move on and talk about why we do a capital campaign. Next slide. So why do we do it? Why undertake a capital campaign? Reason number one, to achieve a strategic purpose or plan or something strategic. Now, I want to come back to that notion of strategy because I think that really underlies all of this. I think it's really fundamental to the whole notion of a campaign is how that campaign aligns with your strategic vision for the organization. But let's come back to that. Let's talk about some of these other things. So capital campaigns help you engage new leadership and volunteers. If you've been doing the same annual fund for many years, as many organizations have, with your same events, your mailings, perhaps personal asks of a limited number of your higher end prospects, there's a tendency, in all honesty, and I say this from personal experience, I worked in-house. I've been a consultant for about 10 years, 15 years, or the better part of 10 or 15 years, sometimes mixing being in-house and out-house at the same time. But I was in-house exclusively for about 25 years. And I can say that at times your leadership and your volunteers get stale doing the same thing year to year. So there is this notion within a campaign that it allows you to sort of expand your horizons, bring on some new people who are looking for challenges and really get people engaged at a level that they haven't been before. The other thing it can do is help you strengthen your fundraising infrastructure. So again, if you're doing that same annual fund each year, all of a sudden you're doing a campaign, you need to raise your stakes, you need to raise more money, you may need to improve either the database you have or the manner in which you deploy that database. I mean, a lot of people in our industry have, you know, they go out and buy a database, they buy Razor's Edge, and I'll pick on them just because they're the easiest one to pick on, and use about, you know, a third of the functionality that Razor's Edge offers, yet they're paying for the whole thing. If you get into a campaign and you're doing it right, you're getting way up there in terms of functionality. You should be using at least 3/4, 75% of that functionality to function effectively. So it strengthens your use of infrastructure. It introduces you to some new things that you might have not done before, that you wouldn't have needed, tools like wealth screening tools and such. So it really has the capacity to strengthen that infrastructure. It certainly gives you the opportunity to raise your profile for your organization, your reputation, your brand. It puts you, you know, quote unquote, in the big leagues in some respects if you do this well, because you know, there's a period of the campaign where you're keeping, you know, we call the silent phase. For those of you familiar with terminology, there's nothing silent about the silent phase of the capital campaign, but you're not out there with your goal until you raise about 2/3 of the money that you actually need towards that goal. But all the while, it is enhancing your brand, bringing recognition to your organization and to your fundraising efforts specifically. Another value of the campaign is it raises the sights of your constituents, those people who have been your annual donors. And I can speak my personal experience. I worked at the hospital at Bassett Healthcare in Cooperstown. That was really my primary job for many years as the vice president for development and a couple of other things. For so many years, our major gift society was $1,000 a year. And we gave people no reason to give more than $1,000 a year, and yet we needed that money. And then we got into capital campaigning, and all of a sudden we were raising the stakes, and all ships rise with the rising tide, as we say. So it really is something to consider in terms of raising the sights of your constituents. It allows you, in that sense, to refine the advancement function within the organization, to really shine a light on what is it we're doing. You know, we're not here strictly as public relations. You know, the public relations is important, but we're here to generate revenue. And when you're in a campaign, nothing makes that clearer than being in a capital campaign, because it's measurable. You see how you're doing. Even if you don't put that thermometer up on the front lawn of your organization, that thermometer exists in your CEO's mind, in your board's mind, in your foundation's mind, whatever your structure is. The other value I would say is securing that transformative gift. And if you haven't had that within your organization, that's that gift which really takes you to the next level and enables you to do things that are within your mission, within your goal, but you haven't had an opportunity to do those yet. And the other thing I would say is that campaigns in general position the leadership of your organization for any CEO, for any head of development. Successfully completing campaign is an important milestone in their career, and it really has significance. They're positioned for future success at that organization or at other organizations, in all candor. And the other thing I'd say, it positions your foundation, if you have such, if you have a foundation, if you have a separate fundraising organization, it gives them this aura of credibility. You know, we're in the big leagues in fundraising now. We've moved out from beyond just annual fund, and annual fund's important. You can't have a capital campaign. Well, I can't say you can't, because many clients try to do that, have a capital campaign without having really an established annual fund, but it's a lot harder to do it that way. So I want to come back to strategy, which I believe is the next slide, and just talk the importance of a strategic plan as it relates to a campaign. So campaigns are not just about raising money. They're about raising money to accomplish a strategic objective. So I don't want to give you a lecture on strategic planning. I'm not qualified to do that. I give you the pyramid for your own edification, and I'm sure many of you have seen something similar to this before. But the point I want to make is that the campaign, as I'll speak to later, is all about the case for support. What are we trying to raise money for? And that can't just, we're trying to raise money because we want to raise a lot of money, just doesn't cut it. It has to be something that's strategic, that works with the vision that you have for your organization, that fits in with your mission. You can demonstrate those specific financial needs. You can do that, and when are you going to achieve your objectives in terms of a timeline, and how are we going to assess those objectives, our success in achieving those objectives? All those things are part of the campaign. So again, it's not just about the money. It's, to use a political phrase of the past, it's kind of like about that vision thing. The campaign really has to fit in with what you see for your organization, and where do we want to be? What are we not doing now that we want to do? So how will this building help us accomplish that? That if in a capital campaign, how will creating an endowment fund help us accomplish that? How will funding specific programs help us accomplish that? But that story has to be told in order to be successful in a capital campaign, or in a campaign. It's not just capital campaigns. So what I will say at this point is we'll go to the, well, why don't we stop here if there are any questions at this point. I don't know, Kayla, if you have anything. If not, I'm happy to keep talking. I'm good at that. No questions as yet? Okay, well, why don't we move along then? So here's a fundamental question as well. And that is, when you're planning a capital campaign, do you look to the outside for what we call campaign counsel? That's a fundamental question. And the question is, do we take on a consultant, which is an expense, or do we fly solo? And of course, the answer is you always take on a consultant, because otherwise people like me don't get work. No, that's not really the answer. The answer is the next slide. We'll talk about it. So I'll give you some reasons, because I have to do this in order to keep my card, my fundraising consultant card. I will give you reasons why, and these are really, I'm going to kid around a little bit, but these are really viable reasons why you might choose a consultant. One is it gives you additional credibility. The old phrase that you're never a prophet in your own land is more true than for a fundraising professional, because as you well know, if you've been doing fundraising for a while, is that everybody is an expert about fundraising. And they will tell you all the things that they know that you don't know. That of course you do know, but they don't want to admit that you know it. And this, you can fight this up to a point, and you can also beat your head against your desk if you'd like, but it's really not, it's not, in some cases, the path of least resistance is to bring in somebody who may or may not know more than you. One would hope they know somewhat more, but you know that is going to give you some additional credibility in the eyes of your CEO, in the eyes of your board, whomever it might be. Because, and why is it going to give you more credibility? Because they're paying for that person in addition, you know, and that's, you know, it's kind of a perceptual thing. If they pay, well, it must be worth it. And it does also provide you some cover for unpopular ideas. So what do we mean by unpopular ideas? Well, you know, all those experts on your, if you have a foundation board or a development committee, whichever it is, all those expert volunteers are going to tell you, oh no, we can't possibly ask people for a specific amount of money. That would be unseemly. Well, no, if the consultants, if they're a good consultant, is going to tell you when you make the ask, you ask for a specific amount of money. Ask the right person for the right amount at the right time. That's, you know, we have all these little cute phrases in our business. And the fact of the matter is, you are gonna run up against resistance especially if it's a first campaign, if not for the organization, but at least for a majority of the board members who are on your foundation group or development committee or fundraising or campaign committee. If you're going to run into resistance to a lot of what I would call basics of campaigning, because I know you will, because I've done this for a long time, and you run into resistance in every organization, and people always have opinions, and unfortunately, many of those opinions aren't accurate, or, you know, they may be valid in a sense, but they're not going to be valid in terms of helping you achieve your campaign goals. The other reason would be that you get, you know, we do this for a living, those of us who are consultants, and so you're getting the value of somebody's experience, not only with your organization, but with all the other organizations where they have done this before. So it's best practices and focusing on the most important priorities. And that's another thing where you have to really run up, in some cases, against, you know, that discussion I had earlier about campaigns for some people being, you know, just doing bigger and better events. You'll have volunteers for whom that's what they think, what they think a campaign is. So that having a consultant there really helps you focus on the most important priorities, and helps you avoid being the one who has to take on the volunteers when they're sort of straying off a little bit. So next slide, a couple more reasons. I think the notion of keeping the campaign on schedule, this is like a wartime effort. It's a mobilization. You want to hit timeline, you want to have a timeline and have milestones and all those things. And we realize that when you're in an organization and you're doing a campaign, that the rest of your work doesn't go away. So having a consultant there can really help you keep things on track. And that's really an important consideration. And then the other thing is, you need to get honesty from somebody who's not emotionally involved. Not emotionally involved with your CEO, not emotionally involved with you, not emotionally involved with your board. You need a truth teller. And with that, I will say that more than anything else, if you're thinking about a campaign and you're looking at to consult or not to consult, what you want, if you go to the route of hiring a consultant, make sure you hire someone whom you feel you can trust, because that's really where it's at. If you don't trust that person, it's not worth spending the money. And if you find yourself in a consulting relationship where you don't trust the person, I would suggest you end that relationship, in all honesty, even if it's with me. So the next point of why go solo would be the other thing to consider, and this is where I get in trouble with my consulting brethren, but I don't really care. Again, I haven't been a consultant my whole life. I've done campaigns with consultants, and I've done campaigns without consultants. And you know, I've had varying degrees of success with both, and some not so successes. So I come at this recognizing that there are legitimate reasons to do it alone. One is, if you're in an organization that has been doing campaigns regularly, you know, as the colleges do, for instance, on a kind of with a 5-year schedule, you know, the never-ending campaign. It's like, well, it's a musical reference, but Bob Dylan has what's called the never-ending tour. He's been touring since 1978 or something. Many of these colleges have the never-ending campaign. It's never stopped. If your organization functions in that mode, it may be legit to say, hey, we've got this. You know, we know how this works. We've done this before. We have the formula. We have the plan. We don't really need to incur the expense, because consultants are an expense. There's no question about it. You can't get around it. It's a pretty significant expense, especially for smaller organizations. The sad part is, I can speak from personal experience, I tend to charge less for smaller organizations, but there is a sort of point of diminishing returns because honestly, in some ways, the time commitment to smaller organizations is in some ways greater because there's less staffing to do some of the things that would otherwise be done. So other things to consider, if you have key prospects already identified and sort of verbally committed and they're your board members and you know where the bulk of the campaign money is coming from, it's another reason to say, hey, we may not need to go outside for this help. If you have, again, guys, campaign hardened, I don't know, but people who are experienced in campaigns in leadership, both at the administrative level, your CEO, and in the development staff, another reason to consider. Timing is one. If you need to get going right away, that's something to consider. And then financial constraints, probably the biggest consideration, because a consultant costs money. And if you do this, the whole process, the whole getting ready to get ready process that I'm about to describe, we can talk about what that cost, but it's going to range anywhere from, $25,000 to, for the colleges, for a big shop, it can be as much as $75,000. I mean, it's a big range, but there is a cost to this, and you'll find out why as we hear more about the process. So with that, why don't we move into the process itself? And we start, so at this point, you've made the decision to hire a consultant. And this is what you can expect. People will call it different things and they may do things a little bit differently, but by and large, this is what you can expect with some variation. And so the first focus is going to be on the internal assessment. Are we ready? Do we have the tools we need in order to succeed in a campaign in-house? And so when I do this, this is typically the first things I'll ask for are kind of data. So it'll be historical. How much money have we raised? How many donors do we have? At what levels? What do we do in terms of stewardship? How do you do donor recognition? What do you do in terms of fundraising events and in terms of cultivation events? So events to me really have two different purposes. One is to raise money. The other is to cultivate existing donors. What do you do in terms of planned gifts, grants, both government and non-government grants? And what's your annual appeal like? All those things, it's all data driven. And there's a big data dump that we ask for when we start this process. We also look at your organizational table, your job descriptions. What are your metrics? Do you have performance expectations? Are they built into your job descriptions? All those kinds of things are things that we'd look at initially. Then we do sort of the personal end of this, and we we interview people. We interview usually, if in a smaller shop, all of the staff. In a bigger shop, the key staff. And then selected board members who are more involved, or if it's a foundation, those who are more actively engaged in the fundraising process and whom we would expect to take a larger role in a potential campaign. And then we look at your systems and your policies, your procedures. What are your practices? How do you do gift processing, acknowledgement? So we'll be looking at your database and how you use that database. I referenced that before. And then finally, for most organizations, if we can, we do benchmarking, and essentially we look at how your prior campaigns have succeeded or not succeeded if you've had prior campaigns, and then also how you do in terms of fundraising relative to a group of peer organizations that are similar to yours. This is a little tricky. The data generally comes off of 990s, so everybody, if you've seen 1990, you've seen 1990. Everybody approaches that process a little bit differently, so you're not always comparing apples to apples, but it's a pretty, it's a good proxy anyway for how various organizations in your sphere are doing from a fundraising perspective. So if we move on to the next slide, we have a little dog situation here.
The first question as well.
We do. I'll start. Yeah, I'm happy to take a question now. Sure.
So Lee from the House of the Good Shepherd says or asks, if your organization had an assessment done 5 years ago and many changes have happened since that time, is there value with working with counsel again, perhaps as a cleanup or an update to that prior assessment?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lee. I think I did an assessment at your organization one time. I don't know if it was more than 5 years ago, I think, but I'm not, I would say, yes, at least a limited assessment. Yeah, because everything's changed. 5 years in development life. Now, Lee, you've been there for quite a long time. In many shops, 5 years, the whole staff will have turned over in that time frame. So it would definitely, be warranted. I mean, I would sort of look at that individually on a case-specific basis, but in general, I would say the answer to that is yes. I hope that answers your question, just because 5 years is a pretty long time, really. I mean, a lot can change. Typically, when we do the assessment, we look at 5-year increments. We really go back about 5 years, because if you go back too much farther than that, generally, the leadership has changed, the development staff has changed, and so it's not really quite as relevant. Moving on. So what comes out of that assessment is a report. This is the first of a series of reports that you'll see, and it gives you some recommendations. And we used to write these reports as narratives. They'd be very long, laborious to write, like 35 and 40 pages. We now, our clients begged us not to do that anymore. So we now do PowerPoints. And it's a pretty intense introspective look at your organization, and we look at org tables. We make suggestions relative to staffing. Oftentimes, we talk about what the leadership requirements would be for that potential campaign in terms of administrative leadership, volunteer leadership, development, fundraising leadership, and so forth. We look at the volunteer structures that we would need. Essentially a campaign org chart. The first org chart I was talking about was really staff org chart, but the secondary would be a campaign org chart. We will look at, as I said earlier, we're looking at your donor database. We will make recommendations. It runs the gamut, especially with small organizations. You have some small organizations that are using homemade, Excel spreadsheets, and that may suit their purposes for an annual fund, but probably not for a campaign where you really need a lot greater degree of sophistication. So we'll make recommendations around database and help do a database review when that time comes. We talk about strategies for donor engagement and cultivation, how we would then move from study into campaign, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, and then what training and resources are needed both for the staff and for the board. Now, training for the board is typically done by the consultants. Training for the staff, I find it sometimes helpful, especially if staff have not had extensive experience in personal major gift solicitation, to send staff away for some of that training. Because to me, it really indicates that, first of all, the organization is serious about this, and it really gives that staff member an opportunity to really be focused on one thing, get them out of the office. As part of my campaign consulting over the years, I would say I've mentored a lot of development professionals who maybe, younger development professionals who weren't as experienced. And I enjoy doing that, but I always recommend going away for intensive training, especially in major gift fundraising and person-to-person solicitation. So that's something we talk about as well. So that's the readiness assessment. So that's the internal look. Once that's completed, we then move on to what we call this fancy term, the strategic advancement study, also known as the feasibility study, campaign study, whatever you want to call it. This is really the external. How does the world, so internally we're looking at the assessment phase, we're looking at how we see ourselves and how we looking, an introspective look. Now we're seeing, how does the world see us? How do our donors see us? How do our non-donors see us? Equally important. unless you got all the donors you need to get some non-donors to become donors for a campaign to be successful. So the first step in that process is creating a vision for your campaign. And that comes back to what I was talking to earlier. You've got to be, we'll talk about that vision in a second in a little bit more detail. But that's an important, that you can't skip that step. And frankly, I find that a lot of organizations try and give that step short shrift, and they just put something down on paper. And that to me is the biggest mistake, because that campaign vision really is your guiding light and becomes the basis for what we then call the case for support. And I'll talk about that as we go on. We recruit a strategic advancement committee. This is the sort of building block of building a campaign volunteer structure. But the strategic advancement committee has some specific functions, and that's overseeing this process. So what is this process? We develop a target interview list of 60 to 80 people. That's an arbitrary number. It really depends on how many interviews we want to conduct. It says here, conduct 30 to 40 interviews. I've done studies with 25 interviews. I've done studies with fewer than 25 interviews, but typically that's a somewhat, it's not something I would generally recommend, although sometimes individual circumstances warrant that, either because there's limited amount of money to spend. It's less than ideal, but you know, I don't know how many of you live in an ideal world. I use that phrase a lot, in an ideal world. I don't live in an ideal world. I'm a very pragmatic fundraiser. So we do what we do when we have to, you know, to get things done. So I've done studies with 15 interviews, and I've done them with more than 40 as well. But in general, that's the number of interviews. And those interviews focus on asking typically people who are donors or would-be donors, people we would like to be donors. We try not to interview just your board members, because frankly, when we want to interview people who are a little further away from the organization, perhaps former board members who have lapsed, you know, who have been less involved frequently, we want to really focus on asking them a couple of different questions. One is, what is your general perception of the organization? How do you view its strengths and weaknesses? What do they do well? What do you think they should do differently? You know, and that sort of thing. Then we provide them with a copy of that campaign vision. That's typically, in this phase anyway, is a written document, a narrative. It may have some fancy graphics attached to it. That's fine. It doesn't have to. It depends on your audience, depends on the nature of the organization. Typically, it's better to have graphics because people are less inclined to read these days, I find. So it's important to have something that's going to be visually compelling. So we have them react to that written vision and say, you know, what do you think about that? We also ask them, what do you think? You know, so the vision will typically lay out, we seek to raise $2 million to do X, Y, and Z. And then we'll say to them, well, what do you think of that campaign, that goal for the campaign? Do you think that's a realistic goal based on your knowledge of this community, of this organization, of this constituency, of this project that we have? Does that sound reasonable to you? And we'll get their sense of that. We also ask them to, if we're going to achieve this goal, we generally will use a tool that may be familiar to many of you, and that's a gift table, which I believe we have a sample of one in this slide deck. And we'll say, you know, how does that gift, does that look, you know, we use that to help determine if that's realistic. And then we say, you know, in order for this campaign to be successful, we're going to need 8 gifts of $100,000 or more. Who are some of those people you think might be able to give gifts like that to this project? And so we'll use this as a means of prospecting, of identifying prospects. And you may think, oh, we know who all our big prospects are. I can guarantee you, having done a number of these studies, that you'll invariably get names come up that have never occurred to you. And that's the value of this process. So and then during this process, we would, and the other thing we typically ask about whether or not people would make a planned gift, especially if they are not in a position to make a multiple-year commitment, a pledge to the campaign. Usually what we do this over a 4-month period. It's pretty labor intensive because it involves all these personal interviews. In prehistoric times, we used to actually, like before March, we used to actually drive to people's homes and do these interviews, or homes or offices in person, face to face. That is less possible these days, as you can well imagine. Witness how I'm speaking to you today. So we do these by phone or by Zoom right now in this reality. It may not change. That's something we'll come back to at the end of the presentation. But we will do usually an interim report and a final report. The final report is after 4 months. The interim report typically after 2 months, after about half the interviews are done, just to give the committee a sense of how things are going. So moving on to the next slide.
We have a question if you want me to jump
Oh
in.
yeah, John, a question by all means.
Heather from our Untitled chapter asks you, do you have any suggestions for where to send staff for training on campaigns? And she noticed that you had recommended earlier it may be better to send them somewhere so they can just focus on that training rather than something in-house.
Yeah, I do. The fundraising school out of Indiana is I think they're still out of Indiana, does great programs. I would focus not so much, I mean, well, let me put it this way. If you have a consultant involved in your campaign, I don't think it would necessarily behoove you to go and again, each situation is different, but I wouldn't necessarily jump right into the campaign training program as much as I would go to, if you haven't done a lot of major gift fundraising yourself, I would go to a major gift training program that really focuses on the ask, because that's the thing that separates the fundraisers who succeed in campaigns and those who don't. Somebody's got to be doing those major gift asks. And if you think you're going to depend on your board to do that or your CEO to do that, you often end up disappointed. I'm being very candid here. So somebody has to get those words coming out of their mouth that say, I want you to join me in making a gift of such and such to further the aims of this campaign. And that someone, more often than not, is going to be whoever it is who's the chief development officer of that organization. And so if you're heading into a campaign and you haven't done a lot of face-to-face asks for major gifts, and whatever a major gift, again, that's every organization has different definition of a major gift, then I would say that it behooves you to get training that's really focused on that. If you hire a consultant, that person should be structuring the campaign for you, in all honesty. I mean, there's no harm in going to campaign training, but I know most of your training budgets are limited. So that would be my counsel in that regard. If you're going to do the campaign by yourself, by all means, you got to go out and learn how to do that. So why spend time and money on a study? This is another one of those questions that I ask that sort of alienates me from my fellow consultants, because there are reasons not to spend that money, but on balance, I think there are. And it comes back to that same question of why do you hire a consultant in the first place? If you're going to do a study, you're pretty hard to do that study on yourself, just as it's pretty hard to do your own internal assessment, because frankly, human nature, you're sort of assessing yourself. That's kind of a tough one. The reason you do the study is it gets you that external consensus on the vision that you've created. And I have to tell you that I've done studies where that vision changed remarkably over the course, based on the feedback. That I did a study, one of my first campaign studies I did as a consultant was for a nursing home that was looking to do something, basically just raising money to rehab a 1950s black architecture building that really wasn't very functional in today's world into a modernized black building. And what came back from the study is you need to do something radical with this nursing home and adopt all these new pods. And for those of you familiar with nursing homes, the pod theory and all these other things, and houses for elder care and so forth. And they actually changed. Based on the study, they actually changed the project and went out and totally turned the campaign around. I've also done studies, I should say, where I've ended the study before it was over, didn't take the full fee, and said to the client, this ain't going to work. And that's something you should be asking a consultant before they start, especially if you're really going out on a limb with your study. And as many organizations are. I mean, I can't tell you, especially in dealing with many smaller organizations, as I tend to when I do work locally. I mean, and I'm doing more and more work locally now, just as my practice has changed. There are many organizations that have, I don't want to say unrealistic expectations, but certainly large expectations of what they can accomplish in a study. And if it ain't going to happen, I'm going to tell them before they spend all the money on the study. And I've done that as well. also happened to be with a different nursing home. Just those are my two examples. But you want to get that external consensus. You want to test the viability of your fundraising goal, assuming people will be honest with you. They have nothing to lose. And it's one of the reasons why, if you're doing a study, you want somebody external to do it rather than somebody from within the organization. There are organizations that have done their own studies. I honestly don't think you get the same level of honesty from the people you're interviewing. You want to identify potential major donors. We already spoke of this, and campaign leaders, because one of the questions we do ask, which I didn't reference earlier, is would you be willing to take a leadership role in a campaign such as this? And I would say invariably, when we come out of the study and look to populate, and expand this, what we call that strategic advancement committee, that small group of, say, 5 or so people who really look just at the study and help shepherd that process. When we look to expand that to 15 people who become the campaign committee, typically those people are people who have self-identified through the study process. And then there is this notion of asking people for their opinions and what they think helps cultivate and engage prospective donors. And that's probably the most important reason to do this. You're getting people to talk about your organization for a concentrated period of time for 45 minutes. How often does that happen? And it's the old adage that I use as the last bullet there. If you want advice, you ask for money. So if the first time you go to these people and you start saying, well, we want to raise someone and we want you to make a gift to help us raise $2 million to do this project, what you'll probably get is a lot of advice on how you can raise $2 million and not any money. But if you want money, you ask for advice. And that's how you get people's buy-in. Again, getting them to talk about your project. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. So once you've completed the study, and again, that gets presented, as I said, at 2 months in, and then probably 4 months in, you move into the campaign planning process where you evolve that strategic advancement committee into a campaign planning committee. And that committee addresses the following things. And again, this is all, again, sort of pre-work to get ready. You modify that campaign vision, that original document that you wrote, and you really make it into a larger case statement. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. You develop and refine your top 100 prospect matrix. Why top 100? Well, the truth of the matter is that depending on the size of the campaign, the success and failure of a campaign is dependent upon, in a big campaign at a college, it's usually the top 100 donors. In a smaller campaign for a smaller social service organization or other organizations, it may be the top 25 or 50, whatever it is. So that top 100 is somewhat of a generic term, but it's developing and refining that matrix for the top prospects. The top prospects. Fundraising is not a socialistic enterprise. We focus on the top of the donor pyramid, especially at the outset of the campaign, because we need to get those gifts in place so that we can build from the bottom up. You need to build the top and then build from the bottom up. You need to develop a campaign plan that would be reviewed by this campaign committee. Typically, your consultant will at least take the first stab at that plan. You as staff would have a shot at it as well, and then we get validation from the campaign committee. Obviously, you need to finalize your leadership. It's very important whom you select as a leader. We'll be talking about that in a second. Your marketing issues, campaign communications, the name of the campaign, the theme, and so forth. The role of planned gifts within the campaign, we will come back to. And then they're very important and oft forgotten is, how do we count gifts? How do we account for, how do we have a gift acceptance policy for this organization? Do we have a campaign counting policy? And what are our naming opportunities? Those are key provisions that you really want to make up in advance before you ask anybody for a gift, because you don't want to be making that up on the fly, because it ultimately alienates donors and embarrasses the organization if you're making it up as you go along. On to the next slide. So launching the campaign. A campaign, there are really 4 key components that I just spoke of, and I want to go back to them in a little bit more detail. The first is the case, and we'll go to that first. So the case is, if we go to the next slide, the key elements. So the case statement, again, it comes out of your campaign vision. It's an expounding on that. It's an elaboration. You're adding things that came back, the feedback, based on feedback you've gotten through the study process. You want to be specific, you want to be compelling, you want to be urgent, and you want to talk about not the needs of the organization, but the needs of the people that your organization serves. So, you know, this is a rough outline. They don't all have to follow this, but an overview of what you're trying to do, some history of your organization, the clients and the constituencies that you serve, you know, how, you know, validate yourselves in that role. How have we been honored? What are the accomplishments we've achieved? You want to have a financial component in there, definitely, because any foundation like the Herkimer Oneida Community Foundation or any other foundation is going to be wanting to look at numbers that illustrate your efficacy. So you want to have, first of all, your budget, you know, and then if you're, for instance, building a building, you want to show how you will function, what they call an operating pro forma post campaign, how that building will impact your annual budget and how you will sustain that building. Because I would say wise philanthropic investors, and some of those are individual donors, many of them are businesses that are donors, and definitely the wisest are typically the foundations and government, you know, those who get grant proposals. They really want to see that not only can you build it, but they want to see that they will come. And that is so key in the fundraising world. So you really have to work on that, and you need, you know, the financial projections so that you know, whoever the CFO is in your organization, or whoever is in charge of finance, or if you have external people who help you with that, you really have to spend time on the financial aspects of this in order to establish your validity. You have to have a budget for the project, and then again, a pro forma, an operating pro forma that shows how you're going to function once the project is completed. Clearly, you want to have vision in here. You want to take the best of that vision that you've already written, and a call to action. What are you expecting the donor to do as a result of having read the case? Moving on, the next thing we'll talk about the key elements of the campaign. First is case. Next one is leadership. So what are we looking for in a good campaign leader? The campaign chair is key. Typically, in many situations, you're looking at a campaign chair or co-chairs who are really going to take an active role in managing that campaign committee with the consultant and with you as the chief development officer, and potentially with the CEO or the head of the organization as well, depending on how actively involved they're going to be. We hope pretty involved, because it's really key and really important. So what are you looking for? You want somebody who can give you time and availability. You know, I worked in New York City for a major medical center there for a couple of years. And typically when you got the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, which probably doesn't exist anymore, it's Chase something else now, JP Morgan Chase. When you got that CEO to head your campaign, that was great. But really what you got was their assistant to head that campaign, which was okay, because they would get them there when they needed to be there. You know, and that's how their lives are run. In our world, it's you typically want somebody where you're going to get their attention, and so you want time and availability. Clearly want someone who's goal-oriented, who has what I would call an appropriate giving capacity. So this is all about peer-to-peer asking. If your campaign needs, if your gift table says you need a lead gift of $1 million, then you want your campaign chair, or one of the chairs, to be someone who's in that vicinity, if not necessarily quite at that level, but approaching that level, if you can possibly get someone, because that's really going to be important. So every organization, every campaign, that's going to be a different number. But again, this is, you know, and I'm an egalitarian kind of guy, but fundraising is not an egalitarian process. You know, it can't just be our most dedicated volunteer. It's got to be somebody who has leverage, frankly, and holds sway with the people who are going to make the biggest difference, you know, who are in that top 100 or top 50 or top 25 or whatever it is for your organization. You want folks who, even if they haven't given to your organization at this level, one thing to look at is what is their giving history to other organizations. You know, it may be that they're newer to your organization, so they haven't made their big gift to you yet, but you know that they have the capacity to make that big gift. So that might be someone you want as a leader. You want them to be committed clearly to your organization, to your plan, to your campaign vision. You know, this last point, ideally, it's someone who's still in the working world and not retired, but honestly, I would say that's more important in a major metropolitan area than it may be for in our area, in all honesty. A lot of times, senior executives from major corporations worked somewhere else and then retire back here, maybe where they grew up. And you know, I would those would be great campaign chairs, even though they're not actively working. I mean, so I think that last bullet I would question in our world. So we move on next to the next. So let's look, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but obviously campaigns depend on who the prospects are, and how we evaluate those prospects. How do we get to that top 100 people? So how do we do that? Well, we look at our donor list clearly. The best prospects are always the ones who've given to you before, even if they haven't necessarily given at the level that you would like them to be giving at this campaign. They certainly have given to you before. Now, one of the things you may consider is wealth screening, as I referenced earlier. You know, these are commercially available products that will give you a range of what potential the people in your donor file might have, what gift giving potential they might have. And in some cases, that would be especially important if you haven't done a campaign before and you haven't asked for a 5-year pledge from somebody and you're really focused on annual fund gifts. It really gives you a sense of what potential exists in your file and how much of this campaign can come from people we already know and how much do we have to go outside from people we don't necessarily know. So wealth screening is an important part of that. Yeah, again, I mentioned the past giving history, and the capital campaign is always an opportunity to upgrade donors from where they've been before, and that's one of the main reasons we do it. Now, with all these data points, so you get a prospect list, and it may be more than 100, maybe quite a bit more than that. You know, all these people, you know, who've given us whatever your criteria is, and it's something your consultant would help you do if you have one. But if it's not, you set a dollar cutoff. Let's say anyone who gave us $1,000 more to the annual fund is someone we want to look at. Then you do a wealth screen, that helps you. But then the other thing you want to do, and it's in some ways rate your prospects. And we rate prospects on 3 criteria. And I give you this little kind of formula, if you will. Not everyone uses it, but at least it's a mindset to think about. To me, there are 3 criteria that we look at, and they aren't equally important. The most important criteria to me is the linkage, the relationship that prospect has with the person who's asking them for the money. That's what we talk about when we talk about leverage. You know, do we have the right person asking for the right person asking the right person for the right gift at the right time? And that goes a long way. You'd be amazed how important that is. Second most thing, if we use this evaluation template, we would rate that on a scale, relationship or linkage on a scale of 1 to 10. Then we'd say, to what extent are they interested in our mission and what we do? That's almost as important. And honestly, in some cases, it's even more important. You know, I can go back and forth on those two, but interest is very important. You know, are they interested? Are they engaged? You know, if we're a hospital, have they been a patient? If we're a social service agency, have they had family members who've used our services, or, you know, have they been involved? Have they been involved as a board member? That's a key sign of interest, obviously. So we rate that on a scale of 1 to 8. And then interestingly, the least important criteria for rating a prospect and evaluating a prospect is their capacity to give. And so we rate that on a scale of 1 to 6. 6, you know, and it varies by campaign and by organization, but you know, those are typically numerical ratings. So if the top gift we're looking for is a $500,000 gift, a 6 would be a $500,000, a 5 might be a $250,000, a 4 might be $100,000, and we go on down like that. And then we do the math. If you actually go through this process, it's somewhat laborious. And if you don't go through the process, at least use it as a mental mindset, as a guide as to how you approach this. If you do it with the full formula, so the top rated prospect has a score of 480. If you do the math, 10 times 8 times 6, 480. I went to a math and science high school, so I figured that one out all by myself. And then we go on down from there. So that's how we look at prospects. And then the last point that we'd look at would be the plan and the campaign plan. And again, that's the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we have a sample gift table. I forgot about that. So I've referenced this before, and this many of you have seen. this is a standard campaign gift table for a $10 million campaign. Just easy because the math is easy. And it shows how many gifts you need at different levels. You know, these tables are formulaic to some extent. There are formula, you can, on the internet, if you type in charitable gift table calculator, you can just pull this up and enter the numbers, and it's like it's your own little Excel spreadsheet you can do and play around with it. I do it all the time. But I wouldn't just go by formula. I think you have to know your organization and know your giving history to, you know, a $3 million gift just may not be in the cards for you. That's not to say it won't happen, but to plan on a $3 million gift would probably not be wise for certain organizations entering a campaign. So this is just a tool that we use. Again, we use it in the study. It's something to think about. And if you do evaluation, if you do that evaluation process, what you then do is you expand this table and then put in the names of the various, so you need 4 prospects at the $3 million level. You would put those prospects off to the side. Who are the 4 prospects at the $3 million level, and who are and so it'll show you what you have going into the campaign and where you're really hurting, where, you know, oftentimes at the top level of the gift table, we don't have the prospects we need in order to be successful. So we either have to be very good and go 1 for 1, you know, we have to bat 1,000, or we have to find some new prospects, one or the other. So moving on to the last, in terms of soliciting prospects, we look at their readiness, and it's based on giving history and they're closest to the institution. This is really, so if they're not close to the institution, they don't have a giving history, obviously we've got to do research on them. Wealth screening be one of those research points, and then get more information. If they don't have a giving history, if they do have a giving history, but they're not close, we need to cultivate them so we can get a bigger gift from them. If they are close and they have a good giving history, then they don't have a giving history, we cultivate them. And then there are those few prospects who are going to be ready to solicit early in the process. And that would be those who have a significant giving history and are close to us at this point. They're ready to be solicited. So those are our prospects. Then moving on, I'm sorry, I've been jumping the gun on this. So the campaign plan, this is typically drafted, as I said, by your consultant. It obviously includes a dollar goal and objectives, you know, how you incorporate the annual fund, if you incorporate it, what is your objective for corporations and foundations, for planned giving, for businesses, for individual gifts. And it, you know, we summarize the case statement, we talk about your leadership. It's basically the innards, the guts of the campaign in one document. It has the final gift table that we use, talks about how we're going to cultivate prospects, all of those things, marketing, communication. And then most importantly, is your timeline for the campaign and your benchmarks. So when you set out a campaign that has a 5-year horizon, you know, we're going to ask people for 5-year commitments. You don't necessarily want to take all 5 years to raise that money. You probably want to get it done in 3, but you might not. It depends on the organization and where you've been. But whatever you set as the horizon for your active fundraising, you want to make sure you have, because the old adage, I think it's Deming is the management theorist who said, if performance is measured, performance improves. And nowhere is that truer than in fundraising. So you want to make sure that if you're starting your campaign today, let's say, where do we want to be by year end? Where do we want to be by a year from now? Where do we want to be by 2 years from now? And you have to be held to account for that. So that's something you negotiate with your fundraiser. Typically, with your fundraising consultant, excuse me. Typically, they will try and push you to be as aggressive as you can possibly be, from my experience. And then you may have to ask them to scale it back a little bit. But it's a negotiation, and it is important. Okay, next slide. So the phases of a campaign, I talked about the quiet or not so quiet stage during that time. So we've now done the planning, we formed the campaign committee, we have our campaign plan, we're going out there. We're still sort of in the planning phase, but at this point we're soliciting lead gifts from, or at least starting to cultivate, I shouldn't say solicit, but cultivating those people whom we've identified at the very tip top of that donor pyramid, whatever we need to do to cultivate them. And each of those is going to require an individual plan. We're also going to be soliciting our board and our campaign committee. We're going to be recruiting that campaign. We're going to approve the plan, developing a major gift strategy. But in there, and it's not, I should add a bullet, we really want to be soliciting board gifts. Then we talk about the major gift stage. Those are the people, again, next level down. We want to start soliciting them. This is all quiet. This is before we may have announced our project in the newspaper. You know, we have a project. We haven't announced, and we're raising money. You may even be announcing gifts, but you don't want to announce a goal, because you don't want to announce that goal until you're sure you can reach it. And typically we say to have raised 50% to 60, you know, to 2/3, a half to 2/3 of the goal. Then finally we get to the point of the public phase where, you know, your mailings and you're approaching people for smaller gifts. So you're moving down the donor pyramid, quite frankly, in the phases of your campaign. Okay, next. Talk about planned giving just for a moment. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But again, I do think planned giving, for those of us who live in upstate New York, it is a planned giving gold mine up here. We have an aging demographic. We have people with accrued resources. There's a transfer of wealth that's going on, generational transfer of wealth. The Community Foundation are experts on this. And as I said, they're the beneficiaries of much of this in our community, but there's no reason why your organization can't be also as well. I mean, there's plenty of money to go around. So planned giving is not always, if your campaign is strictly about building a building, it's not something you're going to want to focus on. Now, that's not to say that if it presents itself in the context of a capital campaign focused on a building, if someone says, I can't do this for you, but I can give you, you know, 50% of my assets, you know, when I'm gone, that doesn't mean you don't walk away from that and say, oh no, that's not good for this campaign. You know, never walk away from someone who suggests a planned gift to you. Take that from someone who has done that, because, and the reasons you would walk away is because your organization's not really set up to do this. We haven't done this before. We don't really know. If you don't know in that situation, find somebody who does know and make sure that you've got to strike when the iron's hot when it comes to planned giving. So it's not always appropriate for your campaign, but it's always an appropriate tool for your organization if someone's talking about giving you a significant planned gift. We do utilize a planned giving question in the campaign study. When it's appropriate in certain campaigns, especially, well, obviously if endowment is a component to that campaign, we use what's called a blended ask, where we ask for a multiple year commitment to the campaign as well as a planned gift. And that's not appropriate for every prospect. It depends on their age. It depends on a lot of things, honestly. And then the last thing I'll say is, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, it gets a little complicated, but consider a legacy gift challenge as part of a comprehensive or an endowment campaign strategy. And that I'll explain real quickly. The next slide is the legacy gift challenge. So basically we're asking donors, we're asking a single donor to put out a matching, essentially a matching gift. They're going to provide current day dollars for, and they'll match gift commitments in the future through planned gifts, through bequests, through trusts, or any what we call irrevocable future gift commitments. So for every $10 of those, so if I'm going to give you $1 million bequest, then the match donor will provide you $1, what is that? That would be $10,000, excuse me. No, $100,000 in current day cash. Now that could go to endowment as well, or not. It's really up to whoever that donor is. But the idea is, you know, and a challenge gift is a great campaign strategy, but people haven't necessarily used it as it relates to planned gifts. But our history with this is that it's been very expensive. So, you know, it's just something to consider. If you don't have experience in planned giving, you probably would need some help on something like that. But especially in those campaigns that are focusing on endowment, because it's the rare donor who will give you, I wouldn't say rare, but it's less common that a donor will give you a multiple year commitment to an endowment campaign. It's more likely that they would give some form of trust, and maybe a lead trust that expires after a certain number of years, or it could be a remainder trust, which doesn't mature until their death, or a bequest, or any number of, charitable gift annuity. There are a number of different options, but it's much more likely that when you're trying to raise money for endowment, those are the kinds of gifts you're going to get, and that's where you get the biggest gifts. And frankly, what it does, as I say this all the time in my presentations, plan giving guarantees that we make our successors successful. You may never see those gifts in your time at that organization unless you plan on being there for life and you're young, but we start seeing, when plan gifts are being made, you start seeing some return on that, typically within 5 years, definitely within 10 years. And the return is significant. I mean, there are organizations out there, and I suspect that some of them are folks listening on this call who were founded based on planned gifts and who are sustained based on the endowment income that enables them to bridge an operating deficit. I know that because that's a lot of small and not so small not-for-profits that are in our midst. So the last thing I think, is there one more? No, okay. Before we go to questions, I just want to talk quickly, and I want to check the time. Okay, well, and talk just very quickly, overview philosophically of fundraising in this COVID environment, and the question of, and what it's a question I've been dealing with with several clients is, can we do a campaign now? And I think the reflex reaction of people initially, and even not so initially, is to say, no, we've got to retrench. We can't do this campaign. People are suffering. How can we be going out and asking for money? People are suffering. And the answer to that is, for some organizations, that may be true, but not for every organization. Just as some people are suffering and other people are not suffering so much at all, especially now. In March, this may have been a different conversation to have, but at this point, when the markets have basically come back to where they were, people who are living off their investment portfolio are basically back where they started, if not better off, if they've been, not me, but if they were savvy investors, they could be doing a lot better. And then there are those businesses in your communities, because I've been doing feasibility study interviews in your community. There are those investors who are doing, those prospective donors who are doing quite well right now, for whatever reason, construction business, a couple of other things that are really taken off in this pandemic environment. So don't make assumptions that it just can't happen. So here are the things to consider if you think it could happen. What is the nature of your campaign? And I'm going to be a little bit bold and go out on a limb here. It's probably not the greatest environment for everybody. I mean, everybody can make a case for need right now, every not-for-profit, because, many museums have been closed. Our donors stopped giving for at least a time. There are any number of reasons why we make the case that the best cases these days, to the extent that you can adapt the case of your organization to address the societal issues that are happening right now. So what's going on? We have a health crisis that's also an economic crisis. So if you're an organization, if you're a social service agency that deals with people in crisis, and economic crisis and health crisis, this is the perfect time to be in a campaign, because nowhere the need, the case couldn't be clearer than it is exactly at this moment in time. So walking away from a case, and I've had clients who were I was in the midst of doing studies for clients, and I have had two clients. One essentially walked away for a period, and they're just getting started back now. And to me, they've missed a window of opportunity already, because they're a little behind where they perhaps might have been had they just kept going, with the understanding that right in the midst of, and things were in March, you might not have kept going, but maybe by mid-April, or certainly by the beginning of May. The other organization sort of plowed through and is and will have to move slower and steadier. It wouldn't be quite the same trajectory that a normal campaign would be because of the variety, you can imagine, but also you have to sort of shift that case to meet the moment to the extent that you can. And again, not everyone can, but everyone can try. So if you're an art museum, you may say, well, how the heck are we going to meet the moment? Well, any museum has education. That's really why museums are museums, because that's why they're not for profits. if they weren't providing education, their case to be a not-for-profit would be a little bit more difficult to make. So if that education then is geared toward people in need, underserved communities, economically disadvantaged, all those kinds of things, and maybe using that as a tool, those are ways you can do it. And I should say there were really three components of need right now, or of issues that are confronting society that really you want to be able to address. You can't necessarily address all of them, but at least in some way try and look at how you might address any of them. One is the health issue related to COVID, which is substantial. The other is the economic issues resulting from the health issues. And the third has become a major point of focus in your community through the Community Foundation, and this is the whole issue of racial inequities and so forth that have plagued our society. That's, these are three sort of interrelated, frankly, because there are racial disparities in healthcare. There are certainly racial disparities in economic opportunity. And so they all intersect. But to the extent that you can make your case relevant to those three overarching issues that are confronting our society, your campaign will be that much more successful. So if you're planning a campaign anyway, I would say try and look at it through that prism and see how we might address those issues through what we're trying to do. I will stop at this point because I want to allow some questions, and I want to make sure I've answered whatever questions that people had. If I didn't, it's hard to know when I've answered your question satisfactorily because I don't have any visual feedback, but please, any questions at this point?
Yeah, we have a very good question from Lee at the House of the Good Shepherd. Lee asks, she makes a compliment to the Community Foundation. Thank you, Lee. She says that we are experts in investing money in our community through our funds, but how does the Community Foundation play a role in an organization's campaign, such as seeking funding from the donor advised funds or the general grant opportunities?
Well, any community foundation is your best friend if you're in a campaign. And certainly in this community, if you're planning a campaign, I think you need to have a conversation with the Community Foundation about that campaign. First of all, they're going to know, they can provide you sort of the external landscape to some extent, not quite a feasibility level or a study level external landscape, but certainly what other campaigns are going on, what else is being on the horizon. And then I say this advisedly with them, the Community Foundation, but it's part of cultivating them as well. They're donors. The Community Foundation has resources they can allocate to campaigns as they deem fit. And so they are a potential donor as well. But they all, both from their unrestricted funds and then also through their donor advised funds. And that, of course, will ultimately involve talking to the people whose donors advised funds those are, because they are advised by donors, but certainly talking to Nick, to Alicia, to others, who are involved directly with the donors and with the programs, Kayla and the other staff, Jan, and talking to them about what you're planning and where they see that fitting would be a good first step. I mean, I don't know if Nick, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, we are currently open right now for our grant round, and I think most organizations on this call would have already been notified of that. But like Mike said, before my time at the Community Foundation, one of my big regrets in my fundraising roles at the colleges was I did not build relationships that were strong with the Community Foundation at the time as far as cultivating them as an actual target. They were always a resource and a knowledge base in the community, but I really didn't look at them as somewhere where I could find some funding for our programs. So that would be one big opportunity, and I'm glad that Lee asked that question while we still have everybody. So,
any other questions out there? Just let's see. Well, if they're not,
type in on map monitoring. You got your contact information down there.
Right. Yeah, certainly if you wanted to call or email me with questions, I have my contact information here. I don't know, everyone got a copy of the slide deck or?
No, but if you're okay with it, we can follow up. All the participants, we can send a copy.
Sure, by all means, I would appreciate that. And happy to answer any questions people have privately if they'd like. And Kayla, I don't know if you wanted to say anything before we wrap up, but I certainly thank you for the opportunity to present today. I hope this met your needs in this unique format for me anyway. I've never quite done anything exactly like this.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, we will definitely send out a copy of this slide deck, as well as we are recording the session. So we'll send out a recording of this too, in case there was anyone on your teams that you wanted to share it with. But thank you everyone for joining us. This was great. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.